Let's start with LA Noire. This game was supposed to be a massive hit. It had one of the largest development and marketing budgets for its time, being backed by the near infinite Rockstar Games money, and featured some of the most groundbreaking and innovative motion capture technology. The game was one of the best crime games out there. It blended action, mystery, detective work, and both great writing and dialogue almost perfectly. It was a critical success and one of my personal favorite games of all time, but for some reason, the sales just couldn't quite reach the heights that Team Bondi and Rockstar were hoping for. There may be several reasons for this, like the high production costs. LA Noire was a very expensive game to make, with estimates suggesting a budget of around 50 to 70 million, and that may not seem too high nowadays where we see budgets ranging from $1 to $200 million, or even 400 million sometimes. But back in 2011, this was a pretty high budget, which made it a high-risk project. The game also had sort of a niche appeal. While there was some action in the game with shootouts and car chases, most of the gameplay made an emphasis on dialogue, interrogation, and puzzle solving through detective work, which was certainly innovative and interesting gameplay to some, myself included, but it didn't have that mass marketing appeal during the age of military FPS dominating the industry at the time. And this was apparent in the game's marketing, which failed to highlight the strengths of the game and sort of gave off a too broad a message about what the game exactly was and what made it stand out. And lastly, the game had limited replayability. While the game's story and plot twists in each investigation were really great the first time around, once you've completed it, there just isn't much of a reason to play it again until enough time has passed that maybe you've forgotten about how each investigation plays out. Because once you know how to do it, there is no challenge on a repeat playthrough really. All of the gameplay hinges on not knowing what to do or who is the criminal or solving the mystery behind the crime. So once you've done that, a repeat playthrough doesn't really sound too exciting. And despite some of these challenges, and the fact that the game had some cut content and was in development hell for several years, the game has still garnered a cult following with hardcore fans in the years since that really appreciate the game for all its strengths, like the storytelling, the facial capture, and the beautiful recreation of 1940s Los Angeles. I really highly recommend everyone try this game out. Next we have Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning, one of my personal favorite fantasy RPGs, but was a game that had a lot of different factors which led to its financial flop, despite receiving positive reviews and creating a die-hard fanbase. First was probably its high development costs and overhyped expectations. Like LA Noire, the budget was around 70 million, which was again pretty high for the time, especially for a brand new studio creating a brand new IP. There's a very long and in-depth story we could go into surrounding the founder of the studio, Kurt Schilling, and how the game was financed through a loan from the state of Rhode Island, which nearly bankrupted the entire state in the aftermath of its financial failure. But that's far too long of a story to tell for the sake of this video. But it is important to mention that there was reportedly a lot of financial mismanagement of the game's development. But why did it flop in the first place? It was a pretty good game, had good reviews, but it hardly had room to breathe when we take a look at the competition in the RPG space at the time. Kingdoms of Amalur released in February 2012, but in November of 2011, just a few months earlier, Skyrim was released. The biggest fantasy RPG release of all time that consumed everyone that's a fan of the genre. The first Dark Souls released just a few months before that as well. Dragon Age 2, The Witcher 2, also released in 2011. Then later in the year of 2012, RPGs like Diablo 3, Mass Effect 3, and so many others would release shortly after Kingdoms of Amalur. It was sandwiched between some of the biggest game releases of all time, and they dropped the game in sort of a dump month, that being February. It had all the cards stacked against it. There really was almost no way for it to make a big splash, which is a real shame because it had some of the biggest and best names in the industry working on it. Ken Ralston as lead designer, who was best known for being lead designer on Morrowind and Oblivion, R.A. Salvatore as a writer who created the game's extensive lore, mythology, and background, is known as one of the best fantasy authors out there. Todd McFarlane, the legendary comic book artist, was in charge of the concept art and the character design. Grant Kirkhope as the composer, who is known for his work on GoldenEye, Banjo-Kazooie, Perfect Dark, and so many other great games. It was a stacked development team, and the game really does stand out as unique with its own identity in a lot of these certain areas, and it has a special kind of magic that fans like myself really love about the game. So again, it's a real shame that this one ended in such a massive financial disaster. But if you're a fan of fantasy RPGs, definitely pick this one up. It just got a remaster a few years ago. Next we have Middle-earth: Shadow of War. The sequel to the beloved Shadow of Mordor was a great follow-up to the original. However, the game mostly flopped for one of the dumbest reasons imaginable: the monetization through microtransactions. Yes, a single-player action game was filled with loot boxes. The game received tons of criticism in the public's eye ahead of its release, and got crushed by a wave of bad press, and rightfully so. 2017 was when loot boxes were taking over the industry and gamers had finally started pushing back against them, and this game got caught right in the crossfire. And the backlash was so bad, in fact, that they pretty quickly patched the microtransactions out of the game entirely, but the damage was already done. And it also likely didn't help that it released super close to Assassin's Creed Origins, and there's some similarities in the gameplay, at least to the average person's eye. And despite a few complaints like the changes to the Nemesis system and the game's narrative, Shadow of War was pretty good for the most part. So it sucks that Warner Bros. Pushed the loot box system into the game that absolutely contributed to its poor reception and bad press. Again, it was a pretty great follow-up to Shadow of Mordor. Next up we have Vanquish. Often regarded as one of the most unique and badass action games of its generation due to its fast-paced combat, stylish design, and innovative mechanics, Vanquish absolutely flew under the radar due to probably several big things. For starters, the game was very niche, all things considered. 2010 was the height of first-person shooters' popularity, and with this being a very stylized third-person action game that had a sort of confusing marketing campaign, it didn't really stand a chance. It released alongside the first Black Ops and Halo Reach as well, not to mention every other great game that released during the fall of 2010 either. The game also lacked multiplayer, which was something most games included at the time, even the ones you wouldn't expect, so that was another reason it might have been looked over. Also, Sega's reputation had began to tank a little bit by this point after a few of its major blunders in the years before its release, and the game didn't really appeal to a casual audience. It was very much a hardcore Japanese action game that focused on a lot of skill-based gameplay. These days it has a die-hard cult following because of the uniqueness and innovative gameplay, but at the time it definitely just wasn't the type of game that was going to appeal to a majority of gamers. That being said, this game is definitely badass. Alien Isolation is a game that many revere as probably the best licensed Alien game, but that didn't stop it from flopping in the eyes of Sega despite its 2 million copies sold. The game was a survival horror rather than an action game like the previous Alien games, and possibly one of the biggest reasons it may have underperformed was because of the previous Alien game, Aliens Colonial Marines. One of the worst shooters developed by Gearbox that was a complete bug-ridden mess and just overall a bad shooter. And with Isolation, some people didn't necessarily love the idea of playing an Alien video game that was a slower survival horror experience either. Not everyone enjoys horror games, so that was maybe a bit of a gamble to go that route with the franchise. And funnily enough, despite being almost universally loved by fans of the game, IGN and GameSpot gave the game a 6 out of 10, which definitely hurt its sales because, unfortunately, people tend to base their game purchases off of mainstream game reviews, especially 10 years ago. But now, over 10 years later, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone that speaks badly about this game, and it's always in the recommendations for horror game fans. Prey 2017. Developed by Arcane, the studio behind Dishonored, is one of the strangest flops of all time because, by all accounts, Prey 2017 is one of the greatest immersive sims of all time. But that's a title it's earned over the years, and not initially. Probably the biggest reason it sold poorly at release was the confusion over the title and branding. The game was a reboot of the Prey franchise, but it had very little connection to the original 2006 game. The 2006 Prey was a first-person shooter with more traditional action-based gameplay, while Prey 2017 was a more open-ended, immersive sim with a heavy focus on exploration, environmental storytelling, and stealth, more akin to something like BioShock. So the disconnect between the two games and confused fans of the original, paired with a failure to draw in potential new buyers to the franchise, and a marketing campaign that didn't really do much to help the situation either. Also, when it did release, it came out very close to the launch of Breath of the Wild and Horizon Zero Dawn, and also during the age of live service popularity on the rise. There was just a lot of unfortunate timing, branding, and marketing which led to poor sales for what some consider the definitive must-play immersive sim. It's kinda nuts how this happened. And I still haven't tried this one myself, but I've been recommended the game in my comments at least 100 times, and I see it in videos all the time on YouTube. Maybe this year's finally the year I'm going to try this one out. Immortals Fenyx Rising is actually one of the better games Ubisoft has made in the last 5 years. Despite receiving positive reviews to the surprise of almost everyone, the game sold poorly, and a planned sequel was even cancelled. One of the most likely reasons for this was the game's heavy resemblance to Breath of the Wild. The game had very similar gameplay and a visual style in both climbing and exploration mechanics that were very clearly influenced by Zelda, which may have led some players to dismiss it as a clone or a Ubisoft knockoff of the game. And in some ways that is true, but really it was much more like an Assassin's Creed Odyssey clone, but maybe even better than that game. Also, it released at a competitive time in the year, even pitted against Ubisoft's own biggest game of the year, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, so that likely didn't help the situation either. And Ubisoft's reputation was also really starting to decline even faster than it previously had, so a lot of people who might have been interested in the game initially were likely turned off the second they saw that Ubisoft was behind it. And in my opinion, the name also really sucked as well. Immortals Fenyx Rising sounds like a shitty mobile game to me, and I think they probably should have just stuck with the original title for the game, which was Gods and Monsters. It's much simpler and possibly brandable, but Immortals Fenyx Rising, that just ain't it. I played this game myself when it released and was actually surprised with how much I enjoyed it. It's not amazing, but it's a better Ubisoft game than most, and I do think unfortunately Ubisoft being attached to the project in name alone really hurt the sales. But if you can find this one on sale, maybe you would be pleasantly surprised as well like I was. And lastly, Mirror's Edge. Developed by DICE and published by EA, Mirror's Edge was one of the first mainstream parkour games that had a really unique visual style and a very intriguing narrative concept, and has a really hardcore fan base these days. However, at release, the game sold poorly. Like a few of the games on this list, this flop can likely be attributed to its very niche appeal. There's no gunplay, very few combat mechanics, and is more just about free-running parkour with a vague narrative going on in the background. And the game didn't exactly receive glowing reviews either, and the marketing wasn't really aiming for the type of audience that the gaming industry had largely shifted towards at the time. It was a very bright and colorful game during an era of dark and post-apocalyptic, dreary sort of games being the most popular. But despite that, the game's fandom grew over the years and were loud enough to get EA's attention that they would finally make a sequel for the game in 2016, which also unfortunately flopped financially as well. The games are loved by the fanbase, but the fanbase just isn't big enough to make for impressive sales figures. And that's 8 great games that flopped financially. Leave a comment down below of some more games that might have flopped financially but you really enjoyed. Leave a like on this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe for more, and I'll see you all in the next one.